Cool. Okay. Let me just close here. Cool. So today I'm going to be talking to you guys looking at lighting. Okay. So first we're just going to look at the physical way that lights are set up and managed in Blender. And then we'll look at some practical examples from some of Blender short films, and then look at a scene of our own. Okay. And when it comes to lighting specifically, since PBR rendering has become a thing, and that materials are generally set up once and not multiple times for lighting setup, lighting is pretty much what determines the overall look of your entire scene. Okay, so whether it's like a noir movie or like a kid show or whatever it is, the lighting determines the mood, the tone, the atmosphere, and all of that. So it is really an important element that is mostly overlooked, and it's really actually quite fun. So lighting is one of the processes where you can really just sit and enjoy, and it's like painting, honestly. So it is really cool. It's lots of fun, and before you start lighting your scenes, you should really just sit and think for a moment about what it is that you're trying to achieve with the look of your film. Okay, so stylistically, if there's any, if you think of a movie like The Incredibles, where the lighting really has a massive role in it, and it's really like a saturated, really pretty high contrast film, or if you look at something like Christopher Robin, where it's really subdued and soft and desaturated. Okay, so depending on the stylistic requirements of the movie, there's a lot of implications for the lighting as well. And then just situational elements, so per scene, what it is that you're trying to achieve, what time of day is it, what direction are you looking at, what time of the year is it, you know, all of these things. Are there any physical lights in the scenes? And all of those things will have an impact on what it is that you need to do and how you need to approach it. Okay, cool. So before we get into the actual examples of it, let's just quickly look at some of the buttons in Blender. Okay, so let's just get okay, and then you can be shiny. You can be metallic. Okay, so first of all, if we just take a blank scene in Blender and render that out. Cool. Firstly, also, we're doing this all in cycles. That's very important for now. And let's turn that off. Okay, so by default, Blender has an environment color assigned to it. So we're going to turn that off for now. This is where you would add an environment light. So light shining from all directions onto your entire scene. Okay, HDR maps are assigned using an environment light. So it is a very useful tool. Also, if you do need to do like texturing or that kind of thing, it's nifty to just throw an environment light or HDR map without having to add in lights for just texturing an object, and you can see what the effect is on that, and you can easily switch between different scenarios or examples or whatever. Okay, but for now, let's just turn that off. So we're starting off with absolutely nothing. And we're going to be looking at the physical light objects that Blender has, okay? And in cycles, those consist of point lights, sunlight, spotlights, and area lights. So those four over there. So let's quickly just take a look at what each of those do. Okay, so I want that back. This is a point light. Okay, a point light is a light that shines equally in all directions. Okay, things like a light bulb or a candle, or you know, where it's a single light sort of shining without any obstructions around it, you would use a point light. Okay. Technically speaking, well, I rarely use them, to be honest. Also, if you think of the fact that since it is shining in all directions, it is more processor heavy. So they do tend to render slightly longer than other lights would necessarily. But anyway, let's look at the actual settings of these. Okay, so first of all, since 2.8, there are two different sections where we can adjust the settings of these. So the first one is the standard settings of that. The second one is if you're actually using a node over here in the shader editor, an emission node for your light source. Okay, so you could use both depending if you wanted to add anything in here as well. So if you say I wanted to add an image in here or adjust the fall off, anything like that, you would tend to stick with adjusting the light over here or in the node tab over there. If there's any of these settings that exist that you don't have over here, you can use those as well, obviously. However, I wouldn't use that color and that strength and that strength. So stick to one of them and take it from there. But it's still pretty new having these two separate options, so who knows what the actual outcomes or pitfalls are of that. Okay, so firstly, just in terms of the settings that we have. Okay, obviously we can change the color of any of our lights if we wanted to, which definitely plays a big part in the final look of your scene. Generally speaking, you tend to stick with, in naturalistic kind of lighting setups, you would have warmer lights and colder lights. Okay, so we'll look at the examples of that just now, but that's more or less what you would go with. In terms of the other settings that we have available to us, all the lights also have a size attribute, okay, whether it's called size or not, and that basically determines the softness of that light source. Okay, and you can see that specifically in the result it has on the shadows of objects. So a very small light source would have very sharp shadows, and a large one would have softer shadows. Okay, so a candle and that kind of thing, you guys should have noticed that if you have a candle, you have very hard, sharp shadows, whereas a big softbox would have very soft shadows. Cool. So in terms of all lights, we generally have attributes to adjust the color, the strength, and the softness of the shadows, or the effect that it has on shadows of those lights. Okay. Other than that, I think that's pretty much all that we have for a point light. Okay, if we move on to the next one, specifically we have a sunlight. Okay.
Can I say something about point lights?
Sure.
So if something's a point light in the physical world, like a light bulb is a point light, because it's, you know, the lights go in all directions, and a candlelight is a point light. It only really changes when you change the amount of influence that it has in the space around it. So if you make a candlelight really tiny and you set the range really small, then it would function like a candlelight. It would look like a candlelight in your scene. But having said that, you could probably get away with the same kind of thing using a spotlight with just a very wide angle spot, because spots in general are cheaper to render than ray tracing in all directions. So I think point lights are useful if the physical light is actually a point light, but don't use a point light for sunlight, for example. That doesn't make sense. And we don't care what happens in the other side of the universe. We only care about what's happening in front of the light. So directional lights are the way for that. That's it.
Cool. Okay, speaking of sunlights, a sunlight, as you can see over here, has two main properties. The one is that its position is irrelevant. Okay, it doesn't matter where it is in your scene, it's going to have the same effect. And it's basically casting a light from a direction. Okay, so whatever direction you point it in, it is shining from all angles in that direction. So if we, for instance, make this as big as we want to, no matter how big we make it, since it's shining from an axis or a vector, it's going to shine in this object infinitely. Okay, which is nifty for outdoor environments, hence calling it a sunlight. Okay, if we look at some of its properties, again, it has the same things. Here, its strength, or not a strength, its softness is called angle. So if we increase that angle, we're going to get softer shadows. Okay, if that was important. So like on an overcast day, you would have much softer shadows than you would on a day with no, well, clouds, I suppose. You'd have much sharper shadows. Again, you can adjust the strength of that, with the color of that, and the strength to make it do exactly what you need it to do. Okay. In terms of the nodes that it has, basically these can be adjusted here. So whether you use this or that, it's probably easier just to stick to those. Okay. Unless you do need to go and adjust anything in the shader editor, you should be able to set everything in the actual properties it has already. Okay. Then to the next one in our list, which is a spotlight. Okay. You guys all know what spotlights are. All of these, since 2.8, you can also adjust to some degree interactively in the scene. You can pull these in. I don't know why it doesn't work now. It's probably just in standard.
There's a little dot underneath the spot.
You can rotate it, and then you can also change the cone size. Just
put it away from the light. No. The little arrow just above the dot.
There we go. Okay, so you can adjust it more interactively in the scene, which is pretty cool. With regard to them, again, they have, it has its own little panel of its spot's shape, okay, where basically you can adjust the size of the cone of the light. Let's just make it a lot brighter so you can see a bit better. Okay, and specifically here, we again have, this is probably the light with the most control that we, or parameters that we can control. So firstly, you also have the option to adjust the size of it, which would again change the softness of the shadows and to some effect the fall off of the light itself. Okay, but then you also have the opportunity to blend the cone angle or the fall off from, well, the cone's fall off. Okay, so if that is set to 0, it will be as soft as your shadows are, but you can blend it more should you want to. Okay, so you can make it softer and smaller. Okay, so if your size is very small and this is on 0, you're going to get a very sharp line over there, but you can go and soften that up a little bit if you want to as well. So there you're breaking away from actual physical light properties. But if you think of something else affecting the light's fall off, so if this was a lampshade or something around the light bulb, at the base of the lamp you would still have very sharp shadows, but because of the influence of the lampshade, it would maybe have that kind of effect. Okay, so there's that. And then the last one that we have is probably the light that I use the most, which is an area light. Okay, so an area light is basically a little light panel. Okay, just as an example, you would have a very similar effect creating an actual panel with an emission material on it. Okay, so doing that, here's my area light, that as a physical light panel, okay, compared with that, you can see the light effect is pretty much the same. Okay, however, obviously the one has slightly more control. Okay, so first of all, the one major difference is that you don't necessarily see the physical panel in of an area light, whereas you would because it is an actual thing. But just with regard to the light itself, again, you can very easily position the direction of it by dragging that little dot onto what you want it to shine onto. Okay, the size of it again affects the softness of the shadows, as did everything else. And then you do also have the options here to change the shape of it. So you can make it a rectangle, so you can go and have very specific things. This I find very, or these I find very useful for doing anything where you want to see the reflection of your light source. So for like product renders or something like that, where you're using your reflections for a purpose. Okay, then those become very, very, very useful. You can make it a disk and a ellipse and all of those things as well. Okay, so depending on what kind of result you want or the shape of the reflection that you're looking for, that's pretty useful as well. Okay. With regard to just this as well, specular highlights on objects, okay, which are pretty much just a reflection of a light source. Okay, so that specular over there, that one over there, they're both reflecting the actual source of this light. Those aren't controlled by the sharpness of that, okay, is controlled by the actual material of the object and not with the light itself. Okay, the size of it is controlled by the light. So if this was much bigger, you would see that that specular highlight would also be much bigger. Okay, however, the softness of it is something to do with that object's material. Okay, then another interesting thing, if we go a little bit deeper into the light settings, actually all objects have these properties, I think. But if we go into the object tab, so away from the light itself, and down to, not that one, visibility. Okay, what we can do over here, okay, most objects have the option to turn off different ray visibility depending on what we want to do. So for instance, you could set a light to only or to not cast any not cast any glossy rays, okay? So that way it won't be visible in any reflections at all, okay? Similarly, you could turn off the diffuse rays of it, which would then obviously not cast any light. So it's basically switching between the actual primary rays, so the first time it's hitting an object in that sense, and the secondary rays, which is the effect that we're seeing in the reflection of that object, if that makes sense. But you'll see now in some of the examples they tend to do this a lot. So often you could light something, but you want a little bit more control over the specular highlights of that object. You could add another light which only has its glossy rays enabled, and you can increase the reflections of those, or the specular highlights of those as well, which is very, very nifty to know about at least. Or if you want to change the color of the speculars or whatever it is. It's a very useful thing to be able to do. Okay. Anyway, I think that's pretty much that in terms of the settings itself. There are a couple of scene settings that you should also know about when it comes to lights, specifically within the light paths and to do with the actual bounces of lights. Okay. So here, if I go, for an example, and make a plane of glass, which there are many of. Oh, that's fine. Ugh, what are you doing? Okay, so how these programs work. Okay, let's just delete that one and create choose our sunlight, for instance. Okay, so say now this was glass, okay, specifically with glass, but we'll look at why now. Okay, in our render settings under the light paths, we have the option to adjust the amount of light bounces for certain things. Okay, so for instance over here, you can see light bounces. Okay, so in 3D and in the real world, light is emitted from our light source, and then every time it comes into contact with the surface, that is considered a bounce, because technically it bounces. So either it bounces off of that object and illuminates something else, okay? Or in the case of see-through or transmissive surfaces, it can then go into that surface and bounce around on the inside and then come around or leave on the opposite side of it, okay? So if we were to make this a glass material, for instance, okay, so there it is see-through and completely see-through and non-reflective, non-rough, so smooth. Okay, so what you can see over here, okay, is it looks fine over here, but all of a sudden inside we get this dark black chunk, okay? And the reason why that is happening is to do with our light bounces. And this is very important if you ever need to render out a bar or anything where there's a lot of glass or that kind of thing, and all of a sudden you have, or broken glass in fact, and you get these black bits inside your glass. Reason for that is that our total light bounces by default is set to 12, and more specifically, the transmission bounces are also set to 12. Okay, so for instance, when the light reaches this first plane of glass, on the front side, that counts as 1 bounce. When it leaves, that's 2. Okay, so technically, for each plane of glass that there is, that constitutes 2 bounces. So after 6 planes of glass, it says, okay, I'm done rendering transmission bounces, and it'll just render those as black. Okay, and the reason for that is to kind of limit how far it actually renders so that it speeds up the render a little bit so we don't just render indefinitely. But to get those back, technically I think there are 50 of these, so if I set that to 100, and the total bounces to 100, there you can now see that the light is shining all the way through. Okay, however, that is going to render infinitely longer. Okay, but you do need to be aware of it, so if you do ever sit with a problem where you get these black chunks inside your glass, that specifically is why. Okay, there we go. Other than that, the physical settings of the rest of these, since 2.8 they have kind of set them by default. These used to always be on 0. And if you ever sit with a lot of fireflies or really slow renders, this is one way that you can speed it up a little bit. Also turning off the reflective and the refractive caustics helps. However, sometimes that does limit certain features, so I've noticed that sometimes when rendering characters' eyes, if you turn off the refractive caustics, that their pupils disappear or their irises disappear. So just be aware of it. However, turning those off will speed up your render, but you'd also lose its effect, obviously. Other than that, I think these settings, you could probably get away with never adjusting them unless you have really slow render times and you need to, or you have very grainy renders as well, like a lot of fireflies. But this should avoid that by default. Okay, anyway, I think that's everything to do with the actual physical things. Do you guys have any questions based on that? Cool. Okay, well, let's look at a few examples.
Do they have isolated lights?
Not easily. Sean says there's a workaround, but I don't know what one. That's stupid because that's, you know, with the whole PBR thing, I understand it, but sometimes you do want to just shine on
Have one light reflecting sound.
just to one
I
object.
suppose the specular diffuse gives you a little bit of
But no light partition equivalent.
light per object.
I mean, that was very cool. You could potentially do something with the render layers. Here. Where'd they go? But I haven't actually seen something which works. Okay, anyway, let's firstly jump into good old Blender 2.79 and look at a specific example from the HM327 book. I'm not sure if you guys seen this. So old. It looks old. Anyway, okay, so we're going to be looking at this scene briefly to look at what they have done to make it render so nicely. Not use off the flash. You? Shame on you. Embrace change.
This 2.79. Yes, is that what you said? Yes. I miss flogging students with a stick, but now we can't have it with even one, can we?
I'm just waiting for that just to get, that's still only rendered one sample, so I'm just waiting for it to get like another sample or two, to sort of a nice baseline to look at. You can if you have a Blender Cloud subscription, which costs $12 a month or something like that. $10 a month. It's $14 if you only get a month, and then you download everything and then you turn it off again. Okay, well, let's just wait there. It's still only done one sample. Okay, so things I just want you to take note of, first of all, is just how they've used light in this scene to really go and sculpt out certain areas of the image. Okay, so clearly we have, in terms of the lighting, very warm sections and then otherwise very gloomy cold sections. And also, if we look at the light which is coming from outside, there it is still like a fairly natural kind of color. Okay, so we don't really have this very orange light coming through the window, but we do have very like orangey bits of the scene, and then also very like colder bits, like this blue cast to the rest of it. So more of an artistic approach to it. There's sample number 2 done after 2.5 minutes. So at 1,000 samples, you can imagine this will take forever. But anyway, so we're going to go and go through what they've actually done to create this kind of light setup. In terms of interior renders, one approach that people sometimes take, but more for like architectural renders, is any light that shines from outside then goes and realistically illuminates the inside of the room. Okay? So if you, in the real world, have an empty room or a room with a window and no other light sources in the middle of the day, generally that light fills up that entire room. Okay? However, that is a very slow process and a very, very render-intensive process. So that takes forever to get clean renders. Okay? So what they've done here is, in fact, not that. Okay? And that's something that I want you guys to notice. And then the other thing is, what you'll notice is how they use light to kind of pinpoint elements of the environment that are either important narratively or just to enhance the clarity of the actual render. Okay, so we can see objects better. It's very easy when we have very detailed environments that either we overlight it or we underlight it in a way that it all just goes like flat, okay, and we lose a lot of detail. So you need to light it in a way that we maintain the contrast of it so that we can clearly identify the different elements of the environment without really, taking too much time or effort to do so. Okay, cool. So let's start off. I'm going to change that to our outliner, and then I'm going to turn off, there are a bunch of physical lights in the scene, which I just want to turn off quickly. As you can see, they weren't scared of lots and lots and lots of objects. Okay, so here I want to turn off those as well as that one, and that should be good. Okay, so just that light and those lights have emission materials on, and I want to not look at those yet. Okay. So in terms of the lights, just like a nice practice to get into the habit of is giving similar objects prefixes. So all their lights, they have the prefix of LGT for lights. They're often for geometry specific, well, not here so much because a lot of these are linked objects, but have a GEO prefix. If it's a rig, you can have a rig prefix, just so that they're all grouped together as well in your outliner, since it's all alphabetical. Okay, but let's turn off everything. Okay, so that should give us a black picture. Okay, great. Cool. So what you'll notice, okay, the basic standard light setup for most, well, that you'll probably learn when you do lighting, is a three-point lighting system. Okay, and those components are pretty much universal when it comes to lighting just about anything. And they consist of a key light, which is your main light source, a full light, which basically softens your shadows or lightens your shadows, and then a rim light, which lights your object from the reverse side to give it a bit more of a better silhouette. Okay, and those three concepts you'll see in all the examples, or both of the examples that we're looking at today. Okay, so first of all, the practical lights in the scene, they have the lights hanging over the barber chairs, there's a light on the wall, and then the physical light coming from outside. So those are, technically speaking, all the lights that we actually have in the scene. The rest of it is really then taking a more artistic approach to enhance the visual or to boost the narrative by highlighting certain parts of the scene. Okay, so first of all, we have a few lights which contribute to the window or the outside world. Okay, so there's one light over there, okay, which is illuminating everything outside. So since this is an interior render or scene, it's unnecessary to go and have an environment light lighting your whole outside of your scene. So they have gone and added a single area light out here to light whatever it is that's going to be outside, which is a very clever approach, I think. Okay. On top of that, for the window, they have a few lights. Some of them, I think, are actually off, so they weren't removed from the scene. But we have a couple over here. There's a physical plane that they used. I'm not sure why. But I think also just to that layer on top of the outside light kind of softens the light coming from, or light shining on the building outside. So you get a bit of a haze on those buildings, so they're not as crisp. And then the light actually coming into the scene, we have over here, there are two of, I believe. There's one that, I think that one's not actually doing anything. Is it this one? There we go. Okay, so that light is the main light source shining from outside into the room. Okay, so depending on the genre of the movie, you could stop lighting now. If you wanted to, which I think is great. And then the other thing that they also have in this scene, and often that they do, or what people do, is adding, as you can see here, this volumetric kind of misty effect to the light. Okay, that is, generally speaking, normally just a cube or a shape that has a volume material assigned to it. But that is something that renders slow. Okay, so be aware of that. That takes a lot of time, or it really slows down your renders, and you can get away with comping it in using just the renders that you, or the layers that you have. Where is it? There it is. Okay, so without it, it looks like that. Okay, so that emulates little dust particles in the air and that kind of thing. So it's a really nice thing to have, but it does render a lot slower. So be aware of that. Should you need it, it is nice to have, but slow. Okay, so I'm going to turn it off for now, just so our renders go a little bit quicker. And I think collectively that is all of the light that is coming from outside. Okay, so that's it. Okay, so that would be our key light in this sense. Okay, even though it is shining from the back, so it's kind of like a rim light, but that's a main light source. Okay, on top of those, then we have the physical lights. Okay, so let's turn that off. And we have the light shining firstly on the wall as well as over the chairs. Okay, so there are the lights shining over here. So that's the light coming down from these physical lights over there. Okay. Also notice how overly saturated the lights are now, okay, on their own, compared to when we turn everything on at the end. Okay, so there are a few lights shining there. And the one nice thing also is these lights really highlight this main chair, which is actually the chair which leads all the way down and into the basement. Okay, so narratively, they kind of point this out from the beginning, which is kind of cool. Okay, Then from there, I don't know where the light is on the wall, but it's one of these fill lights, I think. Anyway, we'll get to those. Then we have all of our fill lights, okay? So here there are plenty of them. Okay, so there's that one doesn't do much. Okay, this one. Okay, so more of a full light for the chairs. So specifically illuminating the floor and the countertop and that kind of thing. Just jumping back to what I said just now, all the light from the window doesn't bounce and illuminate the rest of the room. Okay, which is important to be aware of. Okay, so that way they do need to go and light the rest of the room, specifically using all of these full lights. Okay, there's a light that is then, a lot of them I think they used, but then turned off for the final render. The whole blue cast of the room is then added over there with a full light. I think that one was off. There's another light lighting up just this corner of the, all of these bits over there. So all of these need to be lit at some point since the light isn't bouncing too much. Then this was like technically a bounce light, so the light shining off of the floor and lighting up the roof. From there, there is the physical light for that. So that's not actually a full light, but anyway. Some more blue, and then some more blue, and then some more blue probably. Oh, then this is then, I would say, the main bounce from the light source coming in from the window. Okay, so whatever the light is that shines on the floor and then bounces up, lighting up the rest of the room, that's kind of emulating that. So if we turn on all of those full lights, we get that. Okay, so this is basically the ambient lighting of the room. So not caused by, except for that one, not caused by any physical lights there, but all the physical lights in the room bouncing and then illuminating the room like this. Okay, so one thing is they're not really very distinct shadows from these lights. You can't really see where lights are overlapping, so it's all really nicely blurred into each other. And as I mentioned just now, those very saturated lights tend to desaturate themselves when they're all added together. Okay, I think that was the one on the wall, which is the one on the wall. Yeah, that one. Okay.
Might be because of the filming color space. It's set up so that it's more realistic with lighting. So the more exposure you have, the less saturation. So lights tend to
Desaturate.
balance each other out. If you add a lot of colorful lights, they would tend to desaturate each other.
And also, just how RGB color space works. So if you add all the light colors together, you get white light, as opposed to CMYK, we get black. That also makes sense. Okay, anyway, so that is the ambient lighting of the room. Then if we turn all of those off and look at what else they have, then they have some rim lights pretty much. So kind of just enhancing the specular qualities of certain objects. Okay, so they have highlighting, say now over there, the bust with the buttons in. Okay, so really just pulling that out by adding this rim light on top of that. Okay, they've got one for the cashier, they've got one for the chairs, and then one for the floor, just to add in a little bit more specular detail there. Okay, so really just adding highlights to the scene, so adding contrast. Okay, then the only other things they have after that is they have some fake bouncing lights. Okay, I think that one's also turned off. They've got this one as well. So again, light that's basically bouncing or from this whole side of the room, illuminating just that portion. So fake indirect light, and I think that's pretty much just some more full. Okay, so if we're going to add all of them back onto each other, okay, so starting off with the window and the outside lights. Okay, so remember this isn't really illuminating this portion of the scene almost at all. Okay, there's some effect, but not much really. Okay, then if we add from there the other physical lights, so the chair as well as the light on the wall. Okay, still just mostly key lights. Okay, then adding in the speculars of the rim lights. Okay, then we get this kind of effect. It's very pretty, I must say. Okay, and then the rest is all full light. So taking the fill and adding all of them on, we finally get to that. Okay, so I mean, it's a very, I think there are 19 lights we counted just now. It's a very heavy light setup. But if you think that they've, instead of rendering one light from outside, which is bouncing inside and illuminating the whole room for your full light, they go and kind of sculpt it out, adding individual lights in different places to highlight certain elements. It also gives the scene a lot more contrast. So if you had just one light filling up the whole room, it would have a much like flatter kind of feel to it. Okay. Anyway, I think this is one of the best lighting setups that I've seen physically and had the chance to play with. Okay, so very, very, very cool. Just give it another sample or two.
Chris, how many bounces does the T-Swaps have?
We can look. Guessing not many. Two on that one. See, so the bounces are, if we just play with that for instance, I think all of them are fairly low. The full lights, it's not necessarily true that it's got 1,000 bounces on it. So that should be black. Okay, so the main window light over there, that's only set to have 2 bounces on it. But I'm not sure if we actually increase this that it will start doing a lot more. But it would speed up the renders by limiting that. If we look at the scene settings as well, so here these are also very low. So the maximum bounces for the diffuse rays are 2. So let's just increase that to say 20. So it does, you can see here the reflective and the refractive caustics are also off to speed it up a little bit. Anyway, it's really, you learn a lot by going through these files and seeing how they actually achieve the effects that they have. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then when we get back, we can look at another one and then at our own setup as well. Yeah, we did do that. Where's your sense of excitement in